So I have to sort of work on two computers here, so you have to bear with me if this is a little choppy, the presentation. Good afternoon. I want to quickly start before I show some images of our work with some more general comments about two themes that play really critical roles in the work that we do in our office. The first is the concept of restraint, and the second is of contextualism. Now, I'm aware that both are not exactly the type of catchwords that get people excited these days. And I understand the sort of mundane connotation that a word like context carries today, you know, when every sort of bad developer-driven project uses that to justify their design. You know, it's the sort of, my building is contextual because it's made from brick, just like the building next door sort of thing. But you will see that we are not interested in concept in that sort of literal way, but as an abstract source of design strategies that we think can transform a building into a seemingly inevitable addition to its surroundings. Now, if you're turned off by the word contextual, I can only imagine your excitement about the word restrained. I mean, the word restraint evokes all kinds of uncomfortable associations and images of being physically tied down or imprisoned. In other words, restraint always seems that it must hurt, but it does play an important conceptual role in our design process, and I think it will also explain the sort of attitude that we have toward the meaning of context. Our interest in restraint is twofold. For one, it relates to the issue of consumption, or how we use our resources efficiently, and that's obviously an issue that is becoming more or increasingly important as we are sort of, approaching sort of like a tipping point in the way we live in this world, environmentally speaking. But there's also obviously the issue of formal restraint. Our software capabilities now make it easy to draw almost anything, and there are ungodly amounts of corporate capitalists sort of flow around the globe and are eager to finance literally any architectural spectacle that we can imagine. But my partner Brian and I have a sort of visceral reaction against this and really what it does to our profession, which increasingly seems to be obsessed by a sort of parametrically driven formalism that is almost baroque in its addiction to formal fireworks and sculptural experiments. And we have a little bit of a problem with that. We find it dubious when form is generated simply because it's mathematically possible, and because it promises an aesthetic spectacle. And maybe that's just fine. Maybe that's an appropriate response to a world that's hungry for perpetual entertainment and instant gratification. But we find it troublesome, and I suppose we don't want to really be part of that. I mean, think about it, right? Beyond any aesthetic preferences, or beyond the fact that we now have the tools to create any shape with a click of a mouse, there really is no good reason to flat out dismiss the orthogonal or the perpendicular as a thing of the past, right? I mean, we live in a Cartesian world and probably will do so for the time being, and despite of what some people are trying to tell us, things are still easier to make, easier to fabricate, easier to assemble, easier to install when they are straight than when they are not, and when they are modular than when they are not. And there's this whole idea of mass customization and so on and so forth. We really haven't seen this taking hold in the profession, and it may take decades for this to really come to fruition. This slide here is probably a little bit sophomoric, but there's a reason why we are gridding our chocolate bars. So for us, restraint reminds of the basics. It's a call for frugality, and it's making do with what is at our disposal and within our reach, like dimensional lumber and concrete block, as sort of mundane as it sounds. But there's also more conceptual dimension to the concept of restraint, one that transcends simple frugality. Restraint is our willingness, I think, as architects to approach context with a sense of humility. It's our ability to step back, to listen respectfully to what exists, and to embrace the idea that a building doesn't have to be loud or outrageous or overly flamboyant in order to be noticed or in order to be relevant architecture. In fact, the opposite is probably true. And we believe it's that willingness to listen that ultimately allows a building to connect to the landscape or to its surroundings so that it evolves out of it rather than sitting on it just as a self-referential object. And this is what we are trying to achieve in our work. So let me jump into a handful of projects that I hope will illustrate our attitude. I should mention that we are a very small firm, just 4 people. So there's a real limit to the size of projects we do. But it is, at least for now, the right scale for us to explore the issues that interest us and really learn from the things that are successful and also obviously from the things that turn out to be failures. The camouflage house here, the first project I want to talk about, was actually completed 6 years ago. So it's been a while, but I think it's still a good example of how we approach context and try to transform context into an abstract palette of architectural operations. The site for this project is a heavily wooded, narrow sliver of land on a steep bluff overlooking Green Lake in Wisconsin, in central Wisconsin, very steep, very deep lake, I should say. Our early conceptual studies focused primarily on the colors and textures of the surrounding woods. Starting with the verticality of the trees, one of the conceptual models we made was the shadow box, was actually the first model we made, where we explored the rhythmic shifts between tree trunks as you move through the forest. Captures here, we took a series of photographs where we illuminated the model from behind, and you can sort of see that shift between foreground and background, which we found quite intriguing. It's like when you walk through the trees, right, and you have like this immense depth because of all these sort of vertical lines that are all shifting at different speeds because of the perspective. At the same time, we looked at the ever-changing colors of foliage, shown here as a conceptual diagram where we pixelated an image of the context at decreasing resolutions to transform it into a compositional template for the building skin. And here in this conceptual facade model, for which we used leaves collected at the side with the idea to come up with a cladding system that would create a sort of camouflage-like veil echoing the hues of the side. These studies informed the overall organization of the building skin as a series of solids and voids. You can see this here in this image. The image here was taken from that small little clearing in the woods, and you approach the building basically from that area. It's like a plateau before the land starts dropping off quite dramatically. And you see the floor-to-ceiling windows that allow glimpses into and then through the building at different angles. The building is wrapped in a base layer of untreated cedar, which forms the backdrop for a series of pre-finished epoxy core wood veneer panels, Podium, you probably know about that, which is virtually maintenance-free, or that's what they told us. The size and spacing of the panels overlaps with the structural rhythm of the exposed columns, which adds a sense of sort of controlled randomness to the composition. The house is a very simple bar building, so you basically, let me see if I can do this here. So this is the clearing here. This is the garage, which is connected to the main building with this breezeway, kind of an open-air roof that leads you into an entry foyer, and then penetrates through the main building bar and turns into this covered balcony overlooking the bluff, which is here, right? And then you have this large open living hall, kitchen here, dining, living, etc. And then here at the end, there's a screen porch separated from that, open living hall with a foldable glass door system that can fold away and basically make the screen porch in the summer spatially a part of that, of the living hall. And then stairs lead downstairs. There's a series of bedrooms here that have then access directly to the bluff. Axiomatic drawing showing the main building components, including the layered facade components here. The building is a simple post and beam structure that sits on a concrete shelf. This is the concrete shelf sort of carved into the hill with a long retaining wall that you will see in a moment in one of the images that follows. The section model here that shows sort of like the relationship of that plateau, the higher part of the site, and then the building carved into the bluff, with a drop towards the lake right there. And this is how the building appears from the as a two-story building from the bluff, with the bedrooms on the exposed lower level. And a detailed shot of the layered facade assembly. The cedar will weather, or it has started to weather, into a silver gray, really not unlike the bark of the trees, while the veneer panels will keep their original colors. I mentioned that the maintenance-free aspect turned out to be somewhat problematic. These panels all failed. They were from Spain. They were supposed to be engineered to withstand Wisconsin climate extremes. There was actually a worldwide recall of the product because there were some manufacturing problems in Spain that required Podium to basically replace all Podium products in the entire United States, not only in our project or in Wisconsin, because they started to delaminate, which obviously is a problem. The point is that they don't delaminate. The inside of the house follows the rhythm of the exposed structure. The entire level is actually clad in clear-sealed MDF panels, which is really the same as, as what you see here in this auditorium. And these MDF panels were installed with a reveal between them to sort of mark the occurrence of the structural grid, which is 48 inches on center. As you can see these lines from the floor, from the roof beam sort of reading through. For the concrete retaining wall on the lower level, we experimented with wood boards that we added to the formwork, which was a mixture of wider boards, again marking the structural rhythm of the columns above, and then more narrow ones spaced randomly in between. And then we actually pulled these boards off before the concrete was fully cured, which gave the wall sort of like a more rugged texture, which we tried to achieve. The whole point was that this retaining wall that you walk along as you go downstairs and then walk to your bedroom, that this doesn't become just sort of like a dead blank concrete wall, but one that is highly haptic and tactile. There's a view of the main living dining space. You see the retractable glass door here leading into the screen porch. You can kind of see this nice sheen that these finished MDF panels have. And then a view being in the screen porch overlooking the lake. And here you see the concrete wall. We actually inserted some cleanly milled boards back into the wall to increase even further sort of, the tactile qualities of the wall. And the wall sort of continues out of the house and then terminates into this rock outcropping that actually creates quite a nice little private, sort of a grotto terrace, if you will, from one of the bedrooms. You can see an open screen room at the end of the bar. You're now kind of standing at the bluff looking up. And finally, a view of the clearing and entry court at night. The second project I want to show today is the Topo House, which we completed this spring, or last spring, this year in the spring. We approached the issue of contextuality very similar to the previous project, but while the camouflage house is in a sense based on an abstracted projection of context onto the building volume, this project here develops its three-dimensional form out of the site's topography. The site is located in an area in central Wisconsin called the Driftless region, which is an unglaciated area with softly rolling hills that alternate with these sort of really nice tight ravines. And one of our first context models over here interpreted this distinct topography in a series of parallel folding planes that would be trying to sort of capture the experience of moving through the landscape. This was followed by several generations of study models in which we transformed that first abstract concept study into a more tangible building form until we inserted program elements and arrived at 2 staggered bars forming a low-slung roof plane that extends the grade over parts of the building and then slowly peels itself up from the ground. A series of diagrams here at the bottom show how we broke up the program into 4 individual volumes. You know, if this is sort of like the clean volume with the whole program sort of in it, we started breaking this apart and kind of shifting them vertically against each other and then carving out these volumes to create outdoor spaces or little courtyards within the footprint of the building. And then that sort of base volume is unified by this copper roof band that wraps over the entire building and sort of ties it together, if you will. And then there's a sort of a green roof that laps the green fields from the surroundings over parts of the building. This is a view of the building as you approach it from the southeast. And you can see how the form of the building sort of starts connecting with the land. And the view from the other side. And we kind of feel that, really the building succeeds in it's sort of being embedded in the landscape and following the lines of the land. The plan shows the relationship of enclosed and open spaces. As the central spine sort of connecting these 4 parts, if you will. This is the entry courtyard. You come in here through a large glass door into an entry gallery, and then you actually step up from one part of the building to the other. Actually, from the garage, you kind of step up here, a few steps here, and you follow the existing topography of the site, and you create that sort of internal topography inside the building itself. These diagrams here at the bottom kind of explain this. This is sort of like the Knowlton plan of the house, right? You can kind of see the footprint of the actual occupiable spaces inside the house. Here are green spaces that sort of fill up these voids. And then this is just a diagram showing the different relationship between parts of the floor plates in elevation in relation to each other. So the lightest gray here is the lowest part of the building, and then you step up to the highest part, the darkest gray area here, which is the living space. The section model here at the top gives you an idea, maybe, sort of that internal topography. You kind of see these different layers, in sort of with the highest part actually being this little observatory that penetrates the roof plane. And at the bottom you see sort of looking at the roof edge here as it starts rising up over the lower part of the building and terminating in this large south-facing, over the south-facing edge of the house. This is a view standing on the lower green roof looking south. And you can see where it turns into the folding copper roof that then slopes up toward that observatory. And there's a view of the entry court. So this is really where you come in here. And you will notice how the roof plane is opened up, but the perimeter continues to create that sort of continuous ribbon that we wanted to create. That's the same entry courtyard when you approach it from the ground level. The large glass panel here, that's actually the entry door. And it brings you sort of into the center of the house, which is here. And then you can see we are already a few steps up here. And then there are these steps leading up into the kitchen and the dining room. This is the kitchen looking back. So we just, in the slide before, we stood about here. And then when you turn around, you see the living room beyond. And then these stairs, which penetrate the ceiling plane and then bring you up to this little observatory space. And then the living room opens up to a south-facing patio that is protected by the long cantilever roof here. And that's the cantilever look seen from the side. The material palette of the building is basically limited to cast-in-place concrete, copper, and integrally colored fiber cement panels all materials that are extremely durable and can weather over time and quite gracefully. The other important facade element you see here in this image are these thin vertical fins that I want to talk a little bit about. I mentioned the strong winds in the area that these courtyards sort of create protected outdoor rooms for. And one thing that we were really intrigued by were the sort of dramatic surface deformations that occur when wind blows over the crops and grasses of the surrounding fields. And what at one moment appears to be a sort of perfectly level and smooth horizontal plane suddenly gets warped and distorted when the wind touches it, kind of shown here, on the side. We wanted to capture the sort of surface distortion in the facade with a series of vertical facade fins of interrelated expanding and contracting shapes shown here in a first sort of study, a series of study models. The graphic here on the left shows some of the studies we did to understand the sort of optical illusions and sort of tricks you can play with different shapes as they relate to each other. We ended up with 190 individually shaped aluminum fins that were cut by a water jet. And you see here one of them in the shop, kind of checked by the fabricator. They were all labeled because they obviously had to be installed in the right order to make sure that this sort of visual effect we are trying to achieve could actually work. And then here installed, you can see the distorting sort of appearance that the fins create. And the look of the house really changes, or its character, depending on the angle from which you approach the house. But then obviously also throughout the day as these fins cast different types of shadows on the black backdrop. So there seems to be some sort of motion in the building that is obviously totally static, though. And what we like about what we think worked well is the sort of subtle destabilizing or subverting of the otherwise pretty sort of geometrically rigid form of the house. The next project is the Redaction House, which we actually just finished a few weeks ago and got photographed. So I'm happy to show this here today. And I wanted to show it because we approached context here slightly different than in the previous two examples. The building sits on a tight lot on a small lake in the Milwaukee suburbs, and it really is part of a necklace of sort of prosaic suburban spec homes that crowd the shoreline. You can kind of see that here in this drawing here. The property offered one really nice view, which was when you enter it, you kind of have a straight shot of the lake, and in every other direction you would look would be sort of like this depressing suburban surroundings that sort of destroyed any pleasure you would get out of just looking at the lake. So in a way, this building became for us an exercise in context avoidance, if you will, and it compelled us to design a sort of introvert structure that could basically function as an optic filter, a sort of viewfinder that could frame the views that are desirable and then sort of edit out those that are not. The idea of introversion affected the formal evolution of the house, which is based on a series of simple volumetric reductions shown here in the top row, and then volumetric additions shown here in the bottom row. And it led to a sort of fragmented cube with spatial voids that organize a program inside and sort of create that sort of introversion by creating spaces that are sort of blocked off from the outside but have connections to the spaces within the cube. We basically ended up with a brick podium that interlocks with a wood cube. The brick podium extends to the street as sort of a one-story extension of the podium. And you can kind of see here, I don't know if this shows up, but there's a sort of a series of perforations in the wall that changes in density and size. Behind there is sort of an entry courtyard. And on the other side of that that one-story extension, there's the garage. And this is what you see when you approach the house from the street. And you see that little entrance into this entrance slot into the courtyard, with that perforated brick wall. So you enter the street, from the street into the courtyard, and then walk to the transparent front door, which is here. That frames a very nice view of the lake beyond. This outdoor space basically creates an aesthetically controlled realm, and with the openings of the brick wall decreasing in size as you walk toward the door, you basically so gradually lose visual contact with the context. As a view back, you can kind of see here the changing brick pattern. The process of visual redaction continues on the inside. As I mentioned before, the site is tightly sandwiched between two spec homes that make it rather difficult to enjoy that sort of narrow area of a view that you could sort of take advantage of, shown obviously with this circle here. When we were looking at strategies how to edit this difficult visual panorama, one thing that came to mind was how classified documents get censored, like when the CIA or the NSA now redacts problematic portions of a text but then leaves the inoffensive parts intact and legible. So for us, this meant conceptually to take the existing context and then censor out everything we wouldn't want to see. This is obviously sort of like exaggerated, trying to make a point out of it, but I think you may get the point. The conceptual diagram then became a basis for some studies of the building envelope, where we explored which window arrangements would harvest the most unimpeded views, and then ultimately what would work compositionally for the building as well. This is what you see when you step through the front door, an open living hall with kitchen and dining, and you can see the staggered apertures in the sitting area in the back, right here, right there. And here we're looking into the space from the second story that opens up to that area and looking back. You can kind of see the interplay of solid walls and large apertures that frame certain views while blocking out others. I forgot to mention that the house was designed for a fiber artist and her family of 5. I mean, she's the 5th, so yeah, she has a husband and 3 kids. The house is actually really quite compact, 2,200 square feet. Sounds like a lot, but it's actually very small in today's world of custom homes. And the 2,200 square feet are on the 2 main levels, and then she has her studio right here under that large outdoor terrace that we carved out of the wood cube. In this picture, you may notice these sort of color strips here as part of the facade system of these infill panels between the large windows. When we first talked with the owner about designing her house, we just sort of toured what she has. We were fascinated with the collection of textiles and all sort of colorful yarn and strings in her studio. We wanted to integrate that idea into the facade as a sort of subtle nod at what she does and the colors that make up her own work. And this is a close-up view. You can sort of see how these painted boards, almost become these threads, that weave through the facade. The next project is a remote studio for a country western musician who hired us to design a simple space where he could retreat, contemplate, and compose his music. The building is really brutally simple. It consists of 3 main components: a concrete base, an open volume for the studio itself, and then a steel shroud that sort of covers it. The concrete podium was carved into the hill and provides equipment storage for him. It also serves as the base for the linear studio volume, and then the long sides of the volume are covered with the steel shroud here. So that's the steel shroud, that's the concrete base. You can see how it's cut in, and then there's a green roof that covers a portion of that base that you can step out from the studio. Steel shroud is actually slightly lifted off the concrete plinth to reveal this narrow clear story here. The clear story allowed us to make the studio seemingly kind of float above the concrete base, but it also brings natural light in during the day to the equipment storage below. And at night it glows. You see sort of like this narrow, thin strip of light as you walk through the forest. It's quite dramatic actually when you sort of walk there in the evening. Plan of the studio, you come in here, there's glass enclosure on both ends of this sort of tubular space. You step up here, that's the studio, and then you can step out onto that green roof plinth. This is standing by the entry. There's sort of like an entry, covered so entry porch, if you will, that floats. I don't know if you remember this, but the building basically, this area here extends over, the structure here and then floats over the forest floor. That's how you come in. This is a view through, kind of like a, framing the view beyond. And then this is Eric, the musician, playing his guitar. A few years before, we had worked on this project here, and actually I'm not going to talk about this very much, but there was the Ferris House, and I just want to actually mention this because in this project here, the main body was clad in corten steel. It was actually our first corten steel building, and back then we were eager to create a very consistent patina, so we used an acid-infused solution to clean the steel completely from all marks and oils and so on and so forth. And you can kind of see how even that material turned out to be at the end. For the studio, we wanted to go a little different route and purposefully kept alloy imperfections, surface oils, and roller marks from the steel mill untreated to create a sort of more unpredictable and changing veneer that would contrast with the sort of rigidity of its volumetric expression. The thing about this project is that we think it is unapologetically contemporary, if you will, but at the same time we think it continues very faithfully the tradition of, that sort of Midwestern pastoral architecture, these really simple sort of Platonic forms that these farmers built. And then also it continues, I think, the sort of the legacy of aesthetic simplicity and robust craftsmanship. So the building seems to fit right where it is, and immediately did so, in our opinion at least. And we think that the building has grown into the site remarkably well since it was built. The stacked cabin was designed right around the same time that we worked on the composer's studio. It's a small cabin for a young family from Chicago. And just like the studio, it sits in a remote and heavily wooded area in central Wisconsin. Our budget was very small, and so we focused our attention on a few precise architectural moves. The building sits at the end of an old logging road, and it hugs the slope of a small clearing, which is right here. The axon here shows the principal building components, which is sort of an L-shaped structure carved into the hill. And we have arrived at the form of the house by taking the horizontally organized components of traditional cabin compounds shown here, which usually consist of an open plan longhouse with communal living space, an outhouse, and a freestanding tool shed. And then we are just stacking them up vertically, shown in this diagram here, which allowed us to minimize the footprint of the building on the site and then take advantage of the slope of the site by creating height, which would allow to take advantage of these views you get when you get higher up. The lowest level of the house, of the cabin, houses a workshop, and the building structure and the small washroom that's kind of located right here in the back is the only bathroom in the house. This is really just a shower on a concrete floor and a toilet and a sink, a small sink. And then stairs lead up. This is sort of like the door. You come in on this level. You can also enter from the slope, but stairs are here that lead you up into an open living space that is centered around an oven or a stove, not an oven, a stove, and bracketed by a simple galley kitchen on one side and then a pair of small sleeping rooms on the other. Floor-to-ceiling curtains on either side of the living hall can be arranged to provide levels of privacy for the adjacent sleeping rooms, or visually screen the kitchen when it's not in use. And the curtains also add this sort of central dimension to an otherwise pretty austere and stark interior, which just is polished gray concrete floors and then white walls and ceilings. And then finally, at the top of the cabin right here, we added this extra space. When we started sort of laying this out, we thought this could actually be a space adjacent to the living hall before we sort of realized it was actually much more appropriate to bring it up higher. So it is sort of removed as an overflow bedroom, but can be used, when they don't have guests over as a study, as an observatory. This is the OS house. I should mention that the first 3 or 4 projects that we did when we started our office 10 years ago were small infill houses and duplexes in Milwaukee's inner city, and they were built for $100 a square foot or so. So you can imagine the sort of challenges that we encountered. But those first projects really allowed us to experiment with small compact housing types and the politics really behind building something contemporary in an existing and traditional context. The clients for the OS house, a young family of 4, approached us after seeing those urban infills, and they asked us to design a highly sustainable house for their lot in Racine, Wisconsin. Their budget was better than the $100 I just mentioned. Racine is an industrial city about 20 miles south of Milwaukee, and as probably most of you know, it's the home of Frank Lloyd Wright's Johnson Wax complex, and more recently of the Oscar Mayer Wienermobile crash into a house which made national headlines a few years ago. It's actually just a few blocks north of our site. The neighborhood is actually pretty diverse. This is Lake Michigan here. Downtown starts right here, and the neighborhood is a racially and demographic and economically diverse neighborhood. The more expensive homes are obviously located sort of along the lake, but the predominant typology of these buildings along that lake edge are heavy, opaque volumes, just like this one here, which also was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright in very bad shape. You actually see some plywood here. It's being renovated right now, but it was immediately clear that we wanted to try and go a different route with our building and try to do something where the house doesn't become that wall that totally separates the public realm from the lake beyond, but something that could be a little more accommodating and really play a role of a mediator, if you will. The design process started with a thorough massing analysis where we wanted to see how different volumetric scenarios would perform on the site in terms of their exposure. Exposure to natural light in the sun. Wake up, guys. It's not over yet. How shadows would be cast, how it would address the street, and so on and so forth. The house is really a simple volume with a more or less transparent base. And then within that mass, again, we started carving out spaces that could create these outdoor extensions for the indoor rooms, but all sort of within the perimeter of the building mass itself. This is how the building looks when you approach it from Main Street. And you can see one of those outdoor spaces right here on the corner, upper level. The upper portion of the house is wrapped in a rain screen facade system that then transforms into this sort of delicate scrim of aluminum rods when they start enclosing the outdoor spaces. So the scrim basically completes the reading of the volume, even though we are sort of hacking away at it and opening the volume up. You enter the house from the street and then proceed into an open space, which is this one here, looking back towards the street. And straight on you can see this little carved out courtyard here. There's a tree in this photo, very young. It's now grown a third taller, and it connects to one of those outdoor upper level spaces. The section model here cuts through the stairs that then lead up to a little study, sort of cantilevering over the edge of the house facing the lake. And then a view back of the house with that cantilevered study over here. In the study with the lake. And one of the things is actually a small house too. It's like 1,900 square feet for a family of 4. They share one bathroom. Very radical concept. As you know, today everybody has to have at least one bathroom per bedroom. They decided that they didn't want to do that, so we have one bathroom. And because the building is pretty tight, it was important for us to create a lot of these sort of open sidelines, so you can see here a visual connection between that bathroom, that's not the master, that's the bathroom, but you can sort of look up and then see the study above, giving you a feeling that the house is actually much bigger than it is. And then it's standing on the upper level patios, one facing Lake Michigan, the other one the street. This is actually that little entry courtyard here. The tree, you can kind of see the top of the tree. The tree is now about here, but there's this sort of nice connection that this, the tree creates between the two levels. The building was one of the first LEED Platinum certified homes in the upper Midwest, and actually received the National AIA Code Top 10 Green Award a few years ago. I want to get into much detail about the sustainable system in this project, but there are photovoltaic roof laminates to be used. It turns out they are sort of tricky to work with, but there's also an additional PV array in the backyard. Together they produce about 50% of the house's power, electric power. The house is heated and cooled with a geothermal system. Rainwater is harvested. And then we designed this pretty sophisticated envelope that achieves an R value of 36. It's a ventilated rain screen facade with an 8-inch deep cavity that's behind these concrete fiber panels. And then we insulated it with expanding soy-based expanding foam insulation. There's a close-up view of the facades as we see these sort of apertures that cut through the system. You see the depth that they bridge before you actually get to the insulated envelope of the building. That's where the windows sit. And then here, another detail. This is the venting slit here at the bottom, sort of cleanly detailed, running parallel to the perimeter steel beam that sort of engulfs the house. And close-up view of the scrim holding the corner of the building, even as we carve away the walls of the actual enclosure behind. And look from the bluff. The client for the OS house is a couple with 2 young kids. He's an IT consultant, she's an artist, and we are actually working with them again on the design of a commercial building for a vacant lot in downtown Racine to create a space for an independently run gallery, and then on the upper level her own studio. We usually don't like to show work on the boards for various reasons, but we are almost done with our construction documents for this project, and construction slated for the spring. So it seems okay to talk briefly about this project. The site sits on the western border of downtown. So the house that I just showed is sort of located here. This is downtown. And it's right. This is sort of like the western edge of downtown. This is like the core of it, if you will. The building that we are designing will abut this long party wall. There was a 1-story CMU storage building from the late 1950s that occupied 1/2 of the property until last year, when it was torn down because it was deemed structurally unsafe. And when they tore it down, this old signage reappeared, which we immediately fell in love with. It's a great sort of color scheme, and it made this corner on the way out of downtown an immediate or gave it an immediate sort of iconic presence. And we decided that this was something we wanted to preserve in our design. The building will function as a new cultural anchor that complements the Racine Art Museum, which is right over here. The drawing is probably not quite accurate in terms of the importance of these buildings on downtown. This is a pretty big building designed by the Chicago firm of Grin and Stool and Lynch about 10 years ago or so. It's a very handsome building, was published widely. But we believe that the addition of the building here that we are designing, it will give downtown a sort of an anchor and sandwich downtown between two destinations that make sense to sort of visit on a day like gallery night, or what these cultural events are. People actually using the city for something. What's interesting is that our site is located right where two major street grids in Racine collide, one gridding the city at a slightly different angle as the other. And where they collide, they create a row of these sort of trapezoid urban blocks, or rhombus-shaped blocks. In the drawing here on the left, you can basically not, can you see it? It doesn't show up very well, but this drawing here is supposed to sort of show these different street grids as they collide along this line here where our block is. Our block is that orange sliver. It creates one of those interesting urban conditions that I think we are all drawn to. An extreme example is obviously something like the Flatiron Building in New York. We are not quite as extreme here, but almost every older American city has similar conditions where buildings have to accommodate these skewed boundaries resulting from the kinds of grid overlaps that are part of topographic responses or just mistakes in the survey by the surveyors. So we wanted our building to capture and sort of embody that geometric tension of the site, and looked at ways to distort the shape of the building itself. We started with the rectangular shape of the property and created a narrow zone for service and circulation, and then we pulled that bar back. That's the area where the sign sits, and then this is an area that will give access to the sort of back-of-house functions of the building. And then after shortening the bar, we started to play with the geometry of the upper level, cantilevering it over the sort of original footprint of the building, and then also pulling it sideways as well. And this study model here, one very early study model, sort of starts showing you that effect of these two levels sort of shifting against each other. So here's a plan, the site plan, and the corresponding massing model, which shows you the different elements of the building in relation to each other and how they are embedded within the urban context. And you can see here the studio level has a different facade enclosure system than the base, which is the gallery, but then they sort of merge here in this back, so there's a sort of interlock happening. A quick look at the floor plans. So this is the gallery space here, nice linear volume. Here's back-of-house stuff. We thought in the beginning we could fit this all in this bar that we created. Of course, it turned out we couldn't. So we needed to extend this, but we are creating some walls here for artwork that can be seen from the street as well. And then this recess here, which separates our building from that existing party wall with the signage here, leads you to the door that leads you then up with stairs to her studio, which is really separated in two work zones and then a central sort of workstation in the middle, and then an outdoor space in the back, in the south. So this is how the building will look from the Main Street corner. And you can see how the glazing in the front of the gallery here is pretty minimal and allows this view through the building towards that sign. And then this is the recess here that you walk along to get to the door up to her gallery. The studio is wrapped in a curtain wall with transparent and translucent glazing. We don't really show this here in this rendering, but there's a kind of an interesting rhythm between clear glass and translucent glazing. And then we have these vertical louvers that separate the glass every 35 or 34 inches on center, these louvers occur, so you get an interesting verticality in this otherwise very horizontal building. And I'm almost done, but I couldn't finish this lecture without at least one project about beer. After all, we live in Milwaukee, proudly, and beer is part of our DNA. This is also kind of an older project, but we were asked to reimagine the public spaces in the former Blatt's Brewery in downtown Milwaukee, which is a big masonry block, or maybe more accurately, really a series of beautiful sort of heavy Germanic masonry blocks that are on the National Register of Historic Places, and which in the early 1980s, when the brewery finally closed, were cheaply and ill-conceived converted into offices and apartments. We did a bunch of things there. They included like a roof pavilion and some other things. But the key intervention was the design for a series of rotating bottle doors that sit between the lower part of the two-story entry lobby and a public lounge adjacent to it, sort of behind it. And the doors are 9-foot square aluminum frames, each with 1,600 empty beer bottles suspended in a web of CNC precision-milled neoprene rings. The doors can rotate. There's a center pivot, so they can rotate to either open up that lounge to that lobby space or close them for private function, depending on how the lounge is being used. We actually found 400 of these bottles in the basement of the brewery, which apparently never had been cleaned out when it was first converted in the 1980s, but the 400 bottles wasn't enough. But we actually found the original factory that is still in business, believe it or not, in Milwaukee, that is making bottles for breweries. There's still Miller around, as well as some microbreweries. And they had to be the same bottles, obviously, right? Because you can't make this, you can't CNC mill this web and then have different, even slightly different dimensions for the bottles. We could have not used the old bottles, but since we found the supplier of the original bottles, it sort of worked out. This detail here is probably one of the more interesting drawings that we have produced over the years, and shows the corner of one of those pivot doors and then the custom pivot mechanism. The frames were sharp fabricated on the left and then brought to the side. You can see here they pre-inserted the neoprene web, and then they inserted the bottles on the side. And depending on the position of the door panels, it becomes either a backlit screen for the lobby or a sort of colored lens that brings light into the lounge behind. This is the last picture. Probably a good segue into the cocktail portion of the evening. If you have any questions, I would be happy to take them. If you have time, I don't know what the schedule is, but thank you.